Welcome, everyone. You are in the right place to see licensing and collaboration for manufacturing professionals with your presenters, Jeremy Smith and Scott Wolfsleger. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jana. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking some time to join this webinar today related to licensing and collaboration. I'm here along with Scott Wolfsleger, as Jana mentioned, as well as some additional panelists that I'll introduce in a moment. And at the outset, we'll just say that this topic in the past may have just been of passing interest to you as you worked with your teams in your various locations in your offices. May have had no interest to you, but now we suddenly find ourselves, because of this pandemic, worried about the welfare of our friends, our family, certainly our employees. But on top of all that, now suddenly you're forced to transition your teams to working together in office to remote locations. So now there's likely a very heightened interest in this topic and how to go about it. And based on the number of questions we get in support, as well as that of my other colleagues on the call, it's clear that there's some uncertainty and apprehension, and certainly many of you are new at this. So the goal of today's presentation regarding licensing collaboration is to hopefully take some uncertainty away from that transition, provide some guidance on how you can license, your employees can license their Autodesk products from home or their remote locations. And then after we talk about licensing, Scott will talk about some collaboration options for manufacturing. So let's get into some of the introductions here. Let me first introduce us. In addition to myself, I'll introduce Scott. He'll introduce and give you a little bit more background, and he takes the second half of this. Again, my name is Jeremy. I am in the product support team at Imaginet Solutions Center, part of representing a really great team of professionals who have extensive experience with product support as well as support for licensing and things like that. And so we are all always available to help out when you encounter specific issues. Prior to joining Imaginet, I was also at Autodesk for almost 10 years. My last role there was in sales enablement, but prior to that I also provided tech support for Revit, AutoCAD, Navisworks. I also managed the Revit support team and the Vault support teams. And I got into this industry learning CAD and being a CAD manager at a few MEP firms. So my background is AEC, but the licensing topic, just to assure those of you in the manufacturing industry, is general enough with respect to licensing, and certainly Scott will touch on collaboration tools specific to your industry. And again, Scott will introduce a little bit more of himself. I also want to acknowledge and thank the panelists that we have with us that will be available to take the questions that you'll submit in the second half of this webinar. We have Paul Hamonic, who is a manager of manufacturing solutions team, as well as Carl Smith, who is in a similar role, both with Imaginet. We're also happy to have a couple representatives from Autodesk on the call with us too, that can answer some questions and provide maybe additional detail about what Autodesk is doing during the pandemic to help out with some of these topics too. It's Stephen Bamberger, a partner manager, and Scott Baker, who's a technical specialist with automation and licensing. And we'll come back to the panelist names in this slide so that you remember who is assisting you. So thank you all for joining us. We have a good team to help you today. So going over the high level objective that I talked about to take some uncertainty, we're really breaking this webinar into two primary big buckets. The first is licensing that I'll talk about, and it's going to be a high level in a sense to let you know what the options are, to sort of talk about how you take the licensing scenario or type that you have in your office and how you then use that and what Autodesk can do to allow your employees to activate and use their software from home, either on a device that they take home with them from the office, or if they happen to have one of their own, how they can activate and use the software there. And then the second half that Scott will talk about are the strategies for collaboration and how you can share your data, access data from elsewhere from where you have up till now. And that's the assumption that those of you on the call are either at home now and in this position and have sort of got your way through it, or you're in the process of making all that happen. So hopefully the topics will help you greatly. So with licensing, as you likely know, depending on your company, the number of users you have, there's various license types that you might be familiar with. If those of you who are either executives or don't deal with sort of the details of licensing or activating products for users, that's okay. We just want to make sure that you understand that there is a way for these license types that your company invests in to then transition to another environment. And these are the general 4 types that we have. So there's single user, where a license is associated with an Autodesk account. Each of your employees would have a login that's unique to them, and a product is assigned to them, and we'll talk about how they can use that license at home. And of course, some of you may still have perpetual or standalone seats, and we'll just briefly touch on how you would allow employees to use that. We also have multi-user and maintenance network seats, where they're pulling from a licensed server. And so what do they do in that situation when they're no longer sitting at your office and not in your firewall on your network? We'll talk about how to deal with that briefly. So again, this is very high level. I'll go through briefly. But if any specific questions about any of these come up, save those and submit those, and our panel will be glad to help. So briefly, let's talk about single user access. Just like they would in the office on their computer, your employee who works from home can simply sign in when they access the product. And signing in, of course, will pull a license from their account. It's tied to their access. Now, if they've taken their computer home, the software already is likely installed there. If they are using a home computer and hadn't up until now installed any of the software, we'll talk briefly at the end about where they can go to install that. But in any case, signing in will activate the product on their machine at home. The key thing to keep in mind is that the way it works is they can only be actively signed into one computer at a time. So if they're signed in at home, then they're not actively using another machine, which they probably don't have a choice anyway. So that's very straightforward. They sign in, and that should activate their software that they have installed. I don't have a specific slide for the standalone, which the perpetual seats, but just to address that briefly, they could simply request an activation code if they have a standalone seat. It may already be activated if they took the machine home from the office, but if they install the software, they should just simply be able to request an activation code from Autodesk through AVA, and I'll show you that briefly. But that should, again, be very straightforward for a standalone seat. That's perpetual. Let's now transition briefly to network licenses or multi-user licenses. It's a little bit different. There are a few more options because, again, normally in an office environment, they're pulling an available license from a pool. But now there may be other things that they'd want to do if they're now moving outside of that firewall, working from home. The first option is they can borrow a license, and we'll talk about that. They can request what's called a home use license. And thirdly, if they can get into your firewall through a VPN, they could still pull a license from your license server, but there are some caveats to that we'll talk about briefly. So just to talk about the first option, borrowing a license. It's much like signing out a book at a library, quite frankly. You have an available pool of licenses that you are in a pool. And so if a user then wants to take a license without having to be connected to that license server, they have the option to borrow the license. And they can do so for up to a 6-month period, after which the license will be returned automatically. So they can, through this calendar feature, when they type in the borrow license command or activate that, they can select how long they want that license to be borrowed. It will essentially write the license to their workstation and activate the product without them having to be connected actively to that license server. One thing to keep in mind, and again, we can provide resources or if you have a question about it, there's been some questions about, well, if you have a collection, do they just borrow once and that will activate all the products in the collection? The answer is no. Make sure that if they need multiple products from your collection, AutoCAD, Revit, whatever, that they borrow the license for each product individually. One other thing to keep in mind is that when you borrow a license, very similar to taking a book out from the library, it won't be back on the shelf or available for someone else to take out until they return it. So if things turn around quicker than we thought and your employees return to the office sooner than when they borrowed the license, they would have to return that license so that it's available for other users. And again, feel free to ask questions about that if that was unclear. So that's one option. The second option is home use, where essentially you could submit a request to get a specific serial number to activate on your multi-user or network product to use from home. And there's a form that you can submit the request. I just have a screen capture, and I'll show you ways to get to this location from Autodesk website and another couple of places where the user can be directed to request a home use license. And again, that's primarily for multi-seat, multi-user network seats. There's also a list of eligible products. Not all products are eligible. Most are, but it might be good just for the person that manages your licenses to make sure that the product is eligible for a home use license. And then the last thing that we had mentioned was continuing to have users connect to, through VPN, your license server. VPN will get them into your firewall by providing them access. But there are a couple of things, again, to keep in mind. We get several questions or support cases submitted to us about this setup. For instance, maybe the firewall ports aren't open and so they block access to the license server. Or because of now pulling a license across a WAN or from a user's network, the license times out. So there's ways to sort of set a variable to increase that time. Otherwise, they may find that they're not able to pull a license. So there's some things to keep in mind for that, and there are a lot of knowledge-based articles. We have many blog posts about this. And certainly if you encounter any issues where users are working from home, trying to pull a license and experiencing difficulty, there's ways that we can troubleshoot what's happening with that. So those are really the three primary ways, again, if you have multi-user or maintenance network seats, that you can transition and allow users from home to activate their software. A couple of resources that I'll mention, and I'm going to transition this over to Scott to talk about collaboration. AVA, which is short for Autodesk Virtual Agent. It's a great resource, ava.autodesk.com, for users from home to, if they didn't have an installed software on their home computer, they can search for the product here. That's one way to do it. And here you can also get an activation code if they have a standalone seat, for instance. So AVA is a good resource and jumping point to get into some of the activations, including the home use license request form. You'll see the link there as well. So AVA might be a good place to start if users are unsure where to go to find these resources I mentioned. And of course, another resource that Autodesk, as well as many other companies, I believe Imagine It also has resources. There's a landing page, a resource center related to this pandemic that answers a lot of questions, including the ones that you have about licensing and collaboration. You'll find that this might be a good jumping point if you're wondering where to go or how do I go from office to home. Many of the links that I mentioned or the request for home license, those can also be found on this resource landing page on Autodesk website. So just wanted to point those out so that at least you have one sort of entry point that will, for the most part, get you to where you need to go. So that's, again, just a brief overview of licensing. Whatever type you have, there is an option to transition or activate that software from home. And again, if you experience a specific issue, our support team is glad to help, and we can address those questions at the end. So thank you for your attention on that. I'm going to transition us over to Scott Walslager, who is going to talk about some collaboration options in accessing data remotely.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay, Jeremy?
I can, Scott. Thank you.
Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to attend our webinar. I plan on spending about 15 minutes just talking about different collaboration options and things to think about. I encourage you all to type in questions specific to your cases inside the question and answer window, and we'll get to those at the end. A little bit about myself. My name is Scott Walslager. I've been in the industry for about 25 years. My bachelor's degree is actually in information technology, but I've always focused on manufacturing and architecture engineering infrastructure and data management solutions. I have quite a bit of experience with a breadth of Autodesk solutions as well as competitive solutions to the Autodesk world. So please feel free to ask questions about just about anything when it comes to infrastructure, data management related in the industry, and hopefully we'll be able to address them. Next slide, please. So the one thing that I want to start out by saying is that we're in a situation today that I think that most organizations never anticipated or never planned for. And I say that because in my 25 years of doing this, I've never had a conversation in disaster recovery arena in the IT world of an IT person bringing to attention of what happens when everybody can't come to the office anymore and everybody needs to work at their home office. IT generally doesn't plan for that. They plan for disaster inside the office or disaster in their data center. They rarely talk about illness and the case that we're in today. And what I'm going to focus on in this presentation is what you can do today to improve and help the home worker. But there's also strategies that you can take long-term to, if this ever happens again, what do we do and how do we better prepare for it in the future? So the share and trust first mentality is we don't want to try to secure things too much for users today because we need to get them productive. And we can tighten security as time progresses and as the work moves on. Next slide, please. So the first part is hardware for the remote worker. What do they use? So the licensing-wise, Jeremy just covered. These are really the four things that a remote worker can use to access or work. They can use a laptop, they can use a desktop computer, they got their home computers, and you can use remote desktop technology. And all of these are probably in everybody's situation where you got a combination of them. A worker in your office that normally has a laptop, it's generally not difficult for them to go home and work. That's why they have a laptop to begin with. What if they only have a desktop computer? Do I send that desktop computer home with them, or do I allow them to install the software and license it on their home computer, similar to how Jeremy just addressed a few minutes ago? And then the last option is a remote desktop a possibility? And there's all sorts of remote desktop technologies, different ones out there. I just use Microsoft's remote desktop technology as the general statement of the most common one that people use, and that has its inherent problems. Next slide, please. Next is, what does the data management look like for remote workers? How are they accessing files? Where are they working on these files? What types of technologies are going to support those things? And I think in a large percentage of organizations nowadays, they use a combination of all of the above, or maybe one or two of these. So a remote worker can open a file from Microsoft File Services, means I'm going to my G Drive and I'm opening up a file through a VPN connection. They can use Dropbox. Some people are using that for collaboration in some ways, but that has its inherent problems with all the Autodesk file types and the references that it has. And Box has some of the same issues, or Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive. All of these applications struggle with the complexity of the design environment and the references that are contained within AutoCAD files or the references that are contained within Inventor models or Revit models or any other Autodesk software that you may be using. Microsoft Teams, the great collaboration tools that a lot of offices are deploying now that Imaginet recently implemented. We were using Skype until this week. Actually, we moved over to Microsoft Teams, and we can chat with one another, but not working in an Autodesk environment or not working with DWG files or Inventor models. And then Autodesk File Services. And when I put Autodesk File Services here, there's a general bucket of, we have different technologies on the Autodesk side to help improve that. Working with remote workers, and I'll address a few of those here on the next slide. So next slide, please. So in my IT mind, there's really two categories of workers and how you're going to deal with data and collaboration. One is you bring the data to the users, and I actually got these reversed. I just looked at this slide and read this wrong. And the other is bring the users to the data. So bring the data to the users is more of the Autodesk Vault side of, if you check out a file from Autodesk Vault, it copies all the files and all its relationships down to that local computer, and the person is working like they are locally. That is bring the data to the users model. Bring the users to the data would be more of, I have my project stored on my G drive at my office, and I'm going to remote desktop into my office computer, and then I'm going to open up my files from my G drive like I always have. And for those who have experienced that, there's inherent latency issues in there and other challenges, but it's something that you can deploy immediately to get somebody working again. So it kind of depends on your infrastructure and what your organization is doing. One of these two categories is probably is going to be where you fall, and what our recommendation to work quickly and resolve any issues as far as somebody not being able to work. We would pick one of these two categories to encourage you to go down tomorrow or today for work. Next slide, please. So bring the users to the data challenges. One is software licensing, which Jeremy just addressed most of those related issues and how we can get around most of those issues. Outside partner user authorization. So how is somebody from the outside world going to get to my network and my files and my things that I normally have them access to? And this is an important one because we often communicate through documents still in the world, and even paper, and sending out paper to somebody or sending them out a print set of a set of documents is difficult now because we can't get into the office to print our documents. So how do we communicate with those outside partners effectively and make them aware of any design changes? We could use email and things like that as well. You also have internet connection speed and reliability issues here. So if you have most offices, if they use remote desktop technology where a user can tap into their local workstation at their office today, that infrastructure wasn't planned for 20 users doing that or 100 users doing that or 200 users doing that. That was designed by an IT person for maybe one or two people coming in on our company's internet connection and using up that bandwidth. So now all of a sudden I'm throwing 100 users at my internet connection, and I create a bottleneck where users will all experience delays, and everybody in my organization could slow down if my internet speed isn't fast enough. And to change this right now and today and tomorrow would be very difficult in any organization to increase their internet bandwidth to accommodate that, or put a hardware infrastructure in place to be able to monitor all of these different users. So bringing the users to the data is a pretty big challenge in today's world if it wasn't planned for. Obviously, you need a VPN as well to be able to access your local servers in your offices that would authorize that. Next slide, please. Bring the data to the users. So there's all sorts of different technologies in this realm of technology, and One is direct sharing solutions, where we have a WAN accelerator in place, which is often termed as WAFs, Wide Area File Services. Some of you may have heard of this type of technology, where if I can still tap into my G drive on my corporate network, and I can open up files. And the first time I open up a file, it's going to be relatively slow. It's, if it's a 100 megabyte file, it's going to take however long my bandwidth at my house takes to open it up. But the next time I open up that file, it'll be a little bit quicker because it remembers what was in that file in the past. And most of these technologies work in a similar manner, in encryption through a VPN and other things like that. The indirect data management methods, if you have Autodesk Vault, that is probably the best way to share and work locally that Autodesk has for the manufacturing products currently. But that's also limited to, generally speaking, Vault users. So any designers and maybe managers don't have access to the Vault to be able to see the data or the review, the designs that we had talked about in the previous slide of we normally would print out the document and put it on that manager's desk. How do I distribute that information to him? Also, Microsoft SharePoint is a very common thing that's used within organizations to view and mark up files. And then Autodesk also has Fusion 360 for us to be able to create a team environment where not necessarily designers can only see the data, but anybody on the project team can see any data and anything important to that organization. So Autodesk Vault, SharePoint, and Fusion 360 are kind of what I'm going to focus here on the next slide. So if you go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. So this gives you a good view of all of the different technologies that Autodesk has when it comes to sharing your data with people that are not attached to your network and or are not Autodesk software users. So we'll start out with the Vault Professional side. Is if you're a user of Vault Professional, you have a web client that anybody can use and tap in and view your data. If you don't have Vault Professional and you have Vault Workgroup or Vault Basic, it can be a pretty easy upgrade to Vault Professional just to enable that feature of being able to get users out. Get the data out to the general community in your organization of what's changing inside the Vault, so everybody has view access. That would be a easy change that the Imagine team can help you with and install Vault Pro upgrade from Vault Basic or from Vault Workgroup. Autodesk Drive is another technology that you could use. So you might hear Autodesk 360, A360, a lot of different terms that Autodesk has changed this one over the last couple of years. But this is a way that you can, it's like similar to a Dropbox, where you can check out your files, for instance, from your network and copy them to your Autodesk Drive, and that drive is then synced with your server and your local computer. So if you go to the office, you hit checkout on your Vault files. If you have your default location as the Autodesk Drive, when you check out the files, it's going to copy them all down to the Autodesk Drive, which is also local on your local computer and on the cloud. So if you change computers, you could have local access to it there as well. Fusion Team allows us to publish our Inventor models and Fusion models to a team environment, which allows us to interact and view models and look at properties inside the models and mark up models and things like that. So I can move my data outside into the cloud and put users in this team and have them be able to access the data from anywhere, any place. Autodesk BIM 360 Docs is another tool that Autodesk has for collaboration in the outside world. And some people see the word BIM and they say, well, I'm not BIM in the manufacturing world, but Autodesk BIM 360 Docs does have some benefits to the manufacturing world too, and some overlap with Fusion Team. If you need to distribute documentation, formal plan sets, formal documentation and track documentation versions, Autodesk BIM 360 Docs is a great place to do this. And I relate this Docs world and the manufacturing world to anytime you wanted to print something out into a 36 by 24 sheet and throw it into a giant file cabinet or throw it on somebody's desk to view and mark up, that's what BIM 360 Docs is really good at, is handling that paper process of documentation, distribution, and routing, and getting approvals on documents and things like that. The Autodesk Desktop Connector allows us to synchronize data from the Autodesk Vault or our local computers, if we're not Vault users, to any of these other environments. So we can, similar to if anybody's used Box for synchronization or Google Drive or OneDrive, Autodesk has a little connector in here that allows us to push data from a local computer to the cloud to share with everybody else in Fusion Team and BIM 360 Docs. And again, this is not a difficult process. This process can be set up in minutes just to synchronize data. And then the last part of this is the Fusion Lifecycle portion, where if you have paper process and product lifecycle management processes to work through in your organization, Fusion Lifecycle is a tool to use in that environment. Next slide, please. So why Fusion 360 for Vault? It's a central storage location for everybody on the project teams to access, not limited to just Vault users. All the documents can be contained within a single repository for your projects. You have document and model control, and you can collaborate, view, markup, and print on that environment. And again, easy to set up and get going. And we have a link here on the next slide, I believe, that shows you, this is a little view of what the Fusion Team platform looks like. Somebody sitting on a desktop, they can use the Fusion Team environment to navigate the model. Somebody sitting on an iPad can look at a document in the model, or that's another view in a conference room on an iPhone or an Android device or something like that. And on the next slide, we show you where you can go learn about Fusion Team more on the Autodesk website. You have free access to this until, I believe, May 31st. So you can go activate your account, set up your profile, invite some administrators, and you can set up a project and get running pretty quickly. With that, go to the next slide. And if you have other problems or other situations that you'd like us to talk about, you can type them in the Q&A session, contact your Imaginate sales representative or myself or Jeremy and talk to us about your situation. But we do have other cloud solutions offerings. We have Imaginate Pulse, which helps us integrate the Vault solution with outside cloud providers. So if you want to integrate Vault with Salesforce, or Vault with NetSuite, or Vault with some kind of MRP system, we can do that. Fusion Lifecycle is the product development lifecycle management. We also have skills in that. And also BIM 360. If Fusion 360 is not the right fit for you, that perhaps BIM 360 may be the right fit for you. So with that, I think the next slide is the next question and answer section.
Great. We have had a few questions. Just a reminder to please type your questions into the Q&A pane. Oh, love those on-screen instructions. We did have a couple of things come through I want to read through and ask. Someone asked how quickly the video of this webinar will be available. The short answer is as fast as we can. We will get it posted to our YouTube channel, but it might take us a little bit. I think tomorrow is the latest I would anticipate seeing it posted. Someone wanted to know if we could share the slide deck after the session. So, Jeremy, do you want to send the slides to me and I'll get them posted on our Resources Center for remote collaboration?
Happy to, yep.
So one of the questions that came in was the question, can we run Autodesk software on a virtual machine on a cloud server, AWS or Azure? The answer is yes. It depends on the license type and the license agreement. You can refer to that. But also from the data management side, vaults can be run in AWS and or Azure. It's not set up there right now. It would take a little bit of work to move it out there, but we can definitely assist with that process. And we do have customers using vaults in Amazon successfully.
Okay. And someone was asking about access to the Autodesk Extended Access Program, which is something you alluded to, having access to Fusion Team until May 31st, which is something Autodesk is doing to help people deal with the coronavirus crisis. I don't know if there is a specific link, Stephen or Scott Baker, that's simple.
I can find out for you. I'm not 100% sure because we just announced that. So I'll take that and find out.
So if you go to the Autodesk COVID-19 page, there is a link to the Extended Access Program there. Right now, I'm not seeing any other questions. I can typically speak a lot faster than people can type, however. So I'm going to slow it down and see if there's any other questions before we end the call. It seems as though we have addressed all of the questions that we have right now. As always, please do reach out to us at Imagineit.com, any of the presenters here today. Thank you for spending a little bit of your afternoon or your morning with us.